Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Script Department. I'm John. I'm joined today by Marcus to talk about dialogue and how we write dialogue and what we look for in great dialogue. Before we get into that, if you haven't already, do check out our website, thescriptdepartment.net, for all the latest projects that we get up to with our global network of screenwriters. You can get all the script readings that we have up there as well and all previous episodes of the podcast. Also, follow us on social media. You can hit the links in the description and be sure to subscribe to our podcast. Wherever you get your podcast, just search for The Script Department. And give this video a like on YouTube as well if you want to subscribe to our channel. Okay, Marcus. So let's talk about dialogue. Dialogue is one of these things that gets talked about so much in screenwriting courses and screenwriting handbooks and all that kind of stuff. Can't think of the amount of YouTube videos that have been devoted to the discussion of dialogue and how to write dialogue and things like that. People like Aaron Sorkin and Quentin Tarantino, to name a few, have kind of almost built their reputations on the back of their dialogue writing, and have produced some of the most iconic lines in cinema. It is one of those things, however, that people really struggle with, and people really find it difficult to kind of to be able to execute dialogue very well in a screenplay. What's your kind of, how do you approach that aspect of the screenwriting? What's your kind of view? Do you demonize it the way that some people tend to when it comes to, is it that thing that maybe you're weaker at than other aspects of screenwriting, like some people might feel? I often think dialogue can be some of the weakest aspects of my own writing. How do you kind of approach it?
I have a less is more approach. So I will, before I do anything in terms of the writing process and the planning process, I don't even think about dialogue until way down there, unless it's something very fundamental that needs to go. For me, I approach every film as if it were a silent film, because then I know if it can be told without dialogue, then it's a solid story, it's a solid idea, and it's good to go. So the dialogue for me, I look on as being the dress up. The dressing up on the edges of the thing, the cherry on the top, as it were. And so when I'm writing dialogue, what I look for in particular, and Sorkin does this, and Tarantino in particular does this, I look very much for subtext. So it's what's not said for me that is so much more important than what is necessarily said. And in terms of characterization and things like that. So whatever's, because as human beings, we're not very good. We're not very good at communicating as human beings. We use far more words than we need to, especially if you're, YouTube content creators and ramble on and things, then as I'm demonstrating, then so it's good to, I think it's good to try and capture that element. Obviously it depends on what genre you're writing, but if we're looking at sort of something of a kind of a mainstream naturalistic vibe and things like that, then I think it's great to kind of try and capture that natural element, because we never really say what we want to say. It's encapsulated by the idea of, so you say to someone, "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine." Clearly that person, obviously you can read into that a lot, but if that person has red eyes and whatnot, what are we doing asking them if they're okay? Obviously they're not okay. What you want to do is grab them and go, "Tell me all about everything that's going on with you, and I understand that you've just lost this person and that must be terrible for you, and I want to know everything." And that person wants to go, "Oh my God, yeah, I'm so upset about this, and there was this symbolic bird that flew overhead, and she loved birds, and I hate that." But what actually you get is, "You okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine." And that's what I like to try, and that's what I always aim for in dialogue, is the lesser, is the less is more. And actually what I find more interesting is what the dialogue gives way to in the description, and the gaps between the words and the performance that you can try and kind of inspire in the actor. Because my background, for those of you that don't know, my background is performance and acting and things like that before I came to writing and before I came to screenwriting. And so for me, as from an actor's point of view, great dialogue is so much fun, but actually the key to it, the thing that's far more interesting, is what that dialogue inspires in physicality, and how that dialogue is then supported by the description around it and things like that. So to answer your question, for me is it's all about less is more. It's all about doing the most amount of stuff in the fewest number of words and trying to do that in the most naturalistic way possible. And it's something I struggle with. I think it's the easiest thing to critique, and but it's one of the most difficult things to then set right again.
Yeah, I think I'm with you in the idea that dialogue for me is it's the last thing I think I write in a scene. Dialogue never comes into any of the mapping out of the story or anything like that. As Imagine is for many people, I will write treatment after treatment after treatment. Then I'll write my step outlines. Then I'll do a description, a summary of each scene that I'm going to write. I map it out, in great detail, and then the dialogue starts working its way in a very natural way. Then I think at the end, I'm with you as well on that idea that that less is more, but I'm also happy to let a great kind of, or what I might think is a great kind of flourish of dialogue, just find its way in, even if it isn't needed. Because I do think some of the most memorable lines of dialogue are lines that are just kind of hitting the nail on the head sometimes in movies, that are arguably unnecessary, but they, when they work or when they sound great or when they're fun to imitate, they've kind of earned their spot, haven't they? I think I like the whole less is more approach, though, because I think it does come back to why we write screenplays. We write screenplays because, or the whole point of what we're trying to do at the end of the day is to engage an audience. A good movie is a movie that has engaged an audience for 90 minutes or 2 hours. And I think great dialogue engages an audience. It's not that our characters are saying cool things. It's they're saying things that are making the audience start putting on their thinking hat. They're saying things that the audience are going to want to unpack and find meaning in, because that's what we like to do. We like to find meaning in stuff, and you could have police storming an apartment building and running up the stairs, and the criminal is in the apartment looking out the window. Everybody's saying, "Come on, we got to go." And the criminal just says, "It started raining." And, there's so much meaning in a line like that, where the character isn't packing their bags ready to go. We've learned so much about their whole approach now to this moment, how they're feeling about this moment, even though they haven't talked about that moment, but they have acknowledged that the weather has shifted. Something is shifting here, and so you can have really interesting cryptic lines like that aren't that cryptic, but they make the audience just switch on for a moment, even if they don't realize it. And I think that's that's what I look for in great dialogue.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's that jarring moment that grabs the audience's attention again. And it's interesting you mentioned those kind of those lines of dialogue that are there almost for the sake of it. That not necessarily that example, but they're almost for the sake of it. Because I'd argue that the flourish of that there and grabbing, it started raining outside is subtext, right? It's there to communicate something to the audience in a more interesting and more nuanced way than going, I've given up on leaving or whatever it is the point you're making, and that's the interesting thing about that. But like, I think those great lines of dialogue that are there to put that final point on it. That's one of those things that I find and what I mean by it's the last thing I come to, because that's like the flourish and the brushstroke. Not to be too pretentious about it, but that's like that's the final little thing, isn't it? That's the ripple in the water, just to make it just seem that a little bit more lovely. You don't need it, but it adds something more to it, and it adds that. And I think that's where you get because screenwriting can often be, I find, certainly in when you get to the actual writing and the scripting stage, it can be almost quite formulaic, I find, and it can be quite technical and things like that, because you're thinking about, it's an art form, but it can be quite technical. And I think the dialogue is, and especially those moments and those flourishes, is where the true artistry of it comes in. And And I think that's where you kind of get because it's the thing that the audience remembers. You get the beautiful cinematography and things like that, but that all comes way later after we're done with our stuff. So from the things that a screenwriter can affect, it's the dialogue. And it's the themes and things like that, but again, they're picked up on and tweaked and whatnot by the director later on. So the dialogue is that thing that remains of the screenwriter, and I think that that's why it's so lovely when you get people like Sorkin that are celebrated for their dialogue, and you get people and Tarantino as well, to drop his name again. Because they are, I think especially Sorkin, because he's almost like a rock star screenwriter. He's not a writer director like Tarantino. He just does that, and yeah, he directs sometimes, but most of the stuff he's done, he's just the writer.
He's more famous,
and he's there and he's doing that. Yeah, exactly. Which is so great, because you get the writer directors in the same way you get like a singer songwriter. Perhaps the parallels are there, and you don't necessarily see the brushstrokes from them directly. You see the brushstrokes from the director, or things like that, film being a director's medium. So I think someone like Sorkin is so important to the world of screenwriting, because he is recognized as a writer primarily, which I think is great.
Yeah, I mean, on the subject of Sorkin, he talks about dialogue being musical. And it kind of took me a while to kind of figure out what he means by that, but just figure out how you can kind of apply that way of thinking to your own writing. And I realized that here's the thing. I love Sorkin's films. I think some of the best, not the best lines of dialogue, but just some of the lines that I love to quote every now and again, have come from Sorkin films in the past. But I also think that
great moments.
Sorkin, yeah. I think Sorkin has been quite hazardous for some amateur screenwriters starting out, or aspiring screenwriters starting out, because so many people have tried to emulate his style, and it just doesn't work. Because I think, for me, what Sorkin is like a master musician, in that he can play. It's almost like he's able to play a musical instrument, like I say a piano, perfectly. He can compose amazing music without even thinking, without even having to write anything down. And then it's over here, you've got somebody else trying to play music with a guitar, and they're trying to follow Sorkin's approach, and it's like you're working with almost, it might be music, but it's two different instruments, two different approaches, two different styles, and so on and so forth. And I do think there's a lot of people who try to aspire to follow the kind of learn from Sorkin. But I think what Sorkin does is so unique to his style, the stories he tells. If you look at The Social Network, if you look at Trial of the Chicago 7, if you look at The West Wing and Newsroom and so many of those types of shows and movies, there are lots of kind of at a DNA level almost, there are lots of commonalities that are not going to align with your thriller or with your sitcom or with your... Just because you're writing a story set in the White House doesn't mean there's now parallels there. He writes certain types of characters that allow him then to be able to employ that kind of dialogue, because there's always those similar... I mean, you can almost transplant. I love The Newsroom and I love West Wing and all that, and what I'm about to say might be a little controversial, but I do feel you can take a lot of the characters from The West Wing and train them up to be in a newsroom and drop them into the Newsroom show. And likewise, I think you can take, media experts from the Newsroom show, train them up and put them into the press corps room in the White House, and now suddenly they'll fit in perfectly in the West Wing. You can't do that with Succession, for example, because the style of dialogue in Succession is a totally different style, language. And the characters are quite... Exactly, yeah, they do. He's writing in a very, very particular style for what he writes. And I think so many people put a lot of energy in trying to emulate the Tarantino style, to emulate the Sorkin style, to emulate the style of dialogue that people tend to write. And it's like trying to copy the story structure of those things. That's great if you have the same type of story. But I think for the most part, it's so much more practical to be trying to think about what your characters need and what you need to be trying to do, and to kind of let Sorkin be Sorkin,
and
let
find their
Tarantino be
own way of
Tarantino.
talking.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because Sorkin has this language and his way of doing things, and his characters work in that way. And it's interesting. I finished up writing a play recently that was written for a specific kind of age group and things like that. It was written for teenagers, and I'd written this kind of quite. And I'm not in any way saying it was like Sorkin, because I wouldn't be that arrogant, but this kind of quite bouncy language, and it was quite musical and whimsical. It had a very specific rhythm to it, and they didn't get it. They didn't get it at all. And I then went into a rehearsal with them and sort of said, no, okay, well, here's how I approached it, and this is the way it works. And you provide them the rhythm, and you give them the beat suddenly, and then they can pick it up, and they go, now it all makes sense. And it's something that Sorkin does, but he's very far from the first person to do that, because to sit in the same world as plays, you look no further than William Shakespeare for dialogue, because the Shakespeare is the true master of that. He is the original, and it still holds up. And you look at Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, you look at Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet, you look at Coriolanus, all of these wonderful interpretations of the Bard still work here and now because of that. And when I was teaching, I used to teach English GCSE for a short time, and I got into a bit of an argument with a colleague at the time, a colleague in the English department, and who shall remain nameless. And because we have this way of teaching Shakespeare to kids, and I'll keep this tangent short, I promise you it's relevant. But we have this way of teaching Shakespeare to kids, which is to point out the scaffolding behind the scenes. We point out the iambic pentameter, we point out the rhythms and things like that. And it's important from an English and from a structural point of view and stuff like that. I understand it. But then we were doing Twelfth Night as a school play. And my instruction to the kids was, be aware of it. You know this now. Just so forget about it. And say the lines and read the lines and understand the lines. Now you have this in the back of your mind. You've learnt the rhythm. You've learnt the beat. Now forget about it and just play the part and enjoy the thing. And the English department were furious with me, because how dare you tell them to forget the iambic pentameter? It's completely against it. And of course, Shakespeare was a borderline illiterate working class bloke from Stratford. He did this thing, sure, and he wrote in that way, but he wasn't looking for it to be analysed, and he's certainly not looking for it to work, to be analysed and read in such a way on the stage, because it's just meant to mimic natural speech. Now that, and my point, which I'm coming around to, is when you have people like Sorkin who write in that deliberate way, and you have people, and you approach these scripts in difficult ways, in the sense that David Fincher has to take a month out of his life to sit there and go through the script with you and the cast to understand it properly, then it's important that you do that. It's important that you put the effort in, but ultimately it all comes to the same place, and it all comes to a natural rhythm and an interesting flow. And so I don't think you have to try to be Sorkin with the rhythmic dialogue and everything like that in order to get great dialogue, because there are plenty of people that don't do that. You don't have to be Shakespeare. You don't have to be all of these things. And applying what we were saying earlier on, talking about less is more, is a wildly different, a very, very different approach to Sorkin. When you look at his, you look at some of his, or Tarantino actually is what I'm thinking of there. You think of Pulp Fiction, and the Royale with cheese, all of that stuff. It's word vomit. They're talking and talking and talking and talking and talking, and it works and it's brilliant. But you don't have to do that, because it's very difficult to do, to pick up on your point. You don't have to be Sorkin. You don't have to be Shakespeare. Try that less is more approach and see where it gets you, and lean back on some of that description. And I almost guarantee that it will help you to elevate your writing to certainly a more visual experience, I would say.
I think you mentioned something really interesting there, which is the idea of being able to guide the actors and so on. Um, I think the challenge a lot of one of the mistakes that I think a lot of aspiring screenwriters make is they don't realize the lack of uh, control they'll have over the script later on. As you said, Fincher will sit down and try and understand the script with Sorkin. There's a famous clip on I think the Social Network DVD where you can see them going through the script and him challenging him on lines of dialogue. Do we need this line? Do we need that line? And so on. It's really interesting. You don't, as screenwriters, I mean, you can get kicked off the set if you get too involved in directing the actors and explaining to them how to do things. And your script can be totally just dropped if you're too demanding, I think, in terms of how it should be delivered in the writing style. If you're using the parentheticals to explain how something should be performed, or if you're kind of like pacing it out too specifically in the scenes. And kind of one of the mistakes I used to make when I was starting off was I would always imagine like the best actors in my head performing this dialogue or performing this scene. Like I would imagine, I don't know, let's say I'm writing a gangster film. Maybe I imagine Ray Liotta reading the scene in a Goodfellas, or Joe Pesci or something like that reading the scene. And then, of course, it sounds great coming out of Joe Pesci's mouth, right? Everything does. But my dialogue is not going to be read by an Oscar-winning actor, right? Like you're not going to have the Oscar-winning actors every single time, or most times. It's like it's not a real practical approach to writing. You've got to write in a way that's almost universal, in a way that can be performed in a myriad of ways. I think now, because and I think that goes back to what you were talking about with teaching Shakespeare. The mistake maybe is saying this has to be the only way it can be performed, and actually in opening yourself up to a more versatile and diverse interpretation of the dialogue and interpretation of the performance. You're freeing yourself up, and you're almost taking the pressure off in terms of how to write the dialogue as well. I think it's important to talk about how dialogue can set the tone. It can set the tone of how you want the audience to engage with the story as well. I talked about the importance of dialogue being a kind of a way for activating audiences, like less is more. Something you talked about as well. To me, that kind of less is more tells the audience that you need to be paying attention to this. This isn't something where the answers are all going to be spoon-fed to you. And I'm very heavily reminded of True Detective when I think about that kind of point. I've just brought up, so I Googled the best lines in True Detective, and there's some quotes from Rust Cole. There's like 70 plus here, but I'll just pick out a few of them. Like he says, "This is a world where nothing is solved. Life's barely long enough to get good at one thing. I think human consciousness is a tragic misstep in evolution. The world needs bad men. Trouble with dying later is you've already grown up. In eternity, where there is no time, nothing can grow." I mean, he talks in riddles throughout, right? And as great as those lines are, they barely mean anything, but what they're doing is they're telling you, you need to be paying attention. You're not going to get all the answers handed to you. The clues are going to be cryptic. If an episode of the X-Files is like a regular crossword puzzle, this is the difficult cryptic version of that. And swap out any procedural investigation show. If CSI is the regular crossword, this is the cryptic puzzle. This is the Wordle approach or whatever, and so it's you've got to, I think about the style of dialogue when you're writing your dialogue as well. You've got to be asking yourself, it's not just about how the characters might say something, but it's what kind of level of information do you want the audience to be able to get from these, and how hard do you want them to work for that information?
It really switches me off from a project, TV show or otherwise. I'm not gonna take a turn into our pet peeves again, but it really switches me off from it where you get a film that's basically just made up of quotes. and and Family Guy, and we quite often touch on Family Guy and Seth MacFarlane, because actually in this conversation it's really interesting because his command of dialogue is and command of just sound and things like that, when he's writing stuff for Family Guy and American Dad, things like that. Everybody is like this all the time, and it's stop, because that's how natural. And you don't always finish a thought process before. And we're doing that now. It's so interesting, and it's great to listen to. And again, it connects, and it really connects in a stylistic way. But they also, because it's a wee bit postmodernist, Family Guy, they like to kind of poke fun at the idea of dialogue and things like that. And there's the ongoing joke that Peter turns around and walks in and goes, "It's just been revoked," which is not set up, and things like that. And the joke behind that, other than just the obvious joke that it's not been set up, what the hell are you doing, is that films love that quotable kind of stuff. And I'm not one of those Marvel bashers. I love the Marvel films. I love the Star Wars films and things like that. I'm not one of those those people like Scorsese that thinks it's killing cinema. But you don't always get the best bits of dialogue, and you get the quotable things that are there just for that cool action moment. However, it's actually just to play the other side of that, you also get lines of dialogue like you had in WandaVision, that beautiful line, which is one of the most exciting, one of the most brilliant things, really resonated with me, when Vision is saying to Wanda, what is grief but love persevering? And it just that is one of those lines of dialogue that just reached out and grabbed me by the neck and went, "This is great," and it's really stuck with me. So it's perhaps Marvel's a bad example, but certainly.
I love that you mentioned Marvel, because my favorite line in all the Marvel movies is when Thor gets his ass kicked by his sister, and then he has this vision of his father in the field, and he says, "I can't do it without my hammer. I'm not strong enough." And then he says, "Are you Thor, the god of hammers?" And it is the greatest line, because it says everything you need to know. The point is made, and I just remember watching and just laughing and thinking, yeah, okay, I totally get it. You don't need to say anymore. If I'm Thor, I get it. I get your point. I'm going to go back now. You've made your point. And and it just, as if it couldn't get better, he then punctuates it with this line where, "I'm not as strong as you," and then he says, "No, you're stronger." And it's not the most difficult line to write. And we've seen variations of that kind of dialogue in other movies, but that is the masterstroke of that film. It's the father handing things over to the son, isn't it? It's if he hadn't already inherited the crown, so to speak, he has now, and it's just, it's a really beautiful. Yeah, sorry, you mentioned Marvel, I couldn't resist.
It's no, it's great. It's great though, because because that kind of thing, and I think Marvel and Marvel Star Wars action movies, that kind of science fiction fantasy kind of thing, they get a bit of a bad rap, and I've just contributed to that, to be fair. So I really appreciate you coming back on that. They get a bit of a bad rap for dialogue and that lot and that like. So it's really interesting. But to circle back round again to what we were saying about less is more. Are you Thor, the god of hammers? Is the perfect example of less is more, because you've just covered it. You've got it. It's like, yeah, we get it. He gets it. Everyone gets it. And you laugh a little bit as well, because it's Anthony Hopkins saying, "Are you Thor, the god of hammers?" Which is just, brilliant. Why would you not like that? And I think that I think it's one of those things that Marvel has actually positively contributed to that kind of genre, is that expectation of a higher level of dialogue. And yeah, people get it for being quippy and things like that. But that's fine. That's just a style. That's just the style that universe exists in. That's the world. That's how they talk to each other. That's fine. And like but
that dialogue is telling you
the way
that dialogue is telling you that you can relax. You're going to get moving moments, but you're not going to have to work too hard. But at no point are you just going to become passive and not really engage. You'll laugh. We're going to, even when it's at its darkest, there'll be the occasional little quip. Like even in Endgame, when you hear "on your left," that's a joke from a previous movie. That's a joke from a previous movie. Even at its darkest moments, it's you know it's bringing in these little. It's tonally shifting again, and it's if the God of Hammers joke is making you laugh, it's because we're now shifting direction, and we're going to turn this. We're going to turn around and go back and kick their butts, and that's I think one thing Marvel does really well with dialogue. Actually, I knew we'd bring up Marvel eventually. We couldn't have gone too far into a conversation.
It always ends up there, doesn't it? But
it was kind of
it always gets there in the end, and it's that world. It's that kind of Marvel-y, Star Wars-y kind of situation, and and it's interesting to watch the evolution of that, especially now they're owned by the same company. You watch the evolution of that. You go from the "I hate sand" situation and that horrible monologue, because I think actually the prequel Star Wars and Star Wars in general is kind of a great case study in dialogue, because a lot of it isn't that great. The original cast of the original Star Wars quite famously went on record saying you can't speak this stuff. And George Lucas, is very, very fine at very many things, but perhaps dialogue not one of his strongest suits. And it's interesting to watch now that franchise end up in other hands and things like that. And actually, perhaps the Clone Wars is a really great example of that, because you can see that same style of dialogue, if you can call that a style of dialogue, being then transposed and interpreted by other people in that same world. And then you get I would argue, far stronger moments. None of them spring to mind specifically right now to quote, but there are, you get kind of the Ahsoka stuff going on and quite profound moments in this cartoon, which blow Anakin talking to Padme about hating sand because it's rough and it's coarse and it gets everywhere. That is on the nose dialogue. It's not anything. It's just it's horrible. But that's the point. Is that I feel like Marvel has redeemed that somewhat.
I think one of the things that people come up against, kind of, I don't know, move on from the point, is I think people forget that dialogue isn't really that different from any other action in the movie. I purposely don't kind of devote weeks and weeks and weeks of teaching screenwriting to dialogue, because I wouldn't be putting like several chapters in a book if I wrote a book tomorrow about dialogue, like some authors might. It'd probably have its own chapter, and it has its own designated space on my course, but I wouldn't be. If I'm teaching visual storytelling, I'm naturally working dialogue into that, even if it's not visual storytelling strictly. When a character speaks, they are making a choice. They are revealing something about themselves based purely on the fact that they have chosen to say something in that moment. If a character, if our characters are at a funeral and somebody, we think our protagonist is finally kind of made peace with their deceased loved one, at that funeral, and they're about, Marcus, would you like to say something? And then Marcus decides not to say something and walk away. Well, that not only does the walking away say, well, maybe they were lying when they said they got over it or whatever, but at the same time, it's the fact that they've chosen not to say anything, or it's when somebody decides, again, I mean, not to keep going back to Marvel, but there's that moment in Endgame when it's just Captain America on his own against the whole army, and he stands up and he starts tightening the shield. And I remember thinking, oh, he's going to say, I could do this all day, because that's his line. He's like, you know what, Thanos, I could do this all day. And there's always a part of me whenever I watch that film, just as you're about to hear "on your left," I always think, like, I wonder, was it in the script for him to say, I could do this all day, and then be interrupted, and then have somebody come in and say, "on your left,"
Yeah.
Have Falcon come in and
it
say
feels like, because that intention's definitely there.
Yeah, but he doesn't say it, and he just instead just stands there in silence and just tightens the shield. And that action, I don't know which one I would like more. Actually, I don't know if I'd prefer him just to sit there, stand there silently and stoically, and just tighten the shield, or if I'd prefer him to try and say that line that he's always said and just get it out once more right before the end. But they don't, and they actually, I think it's the mature decision not to. Though I think I would love it either way. I think it's the mature decision not to, because he's how this is a guy who loves to say that line, and he'll say it in every in every showdown when things are at their worst. How bad is this showdown? How emotionally overwhelmed is he right now in this moment that he won't say it? And there's nobody there to interrupt him, although, there will be in a few seconds.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
To me, that's just, I think that's a great example.
Course, yeah.
Exactly. And it's a great example of less is more, but it's also a great example of how the choice not to speak or the choice to speak is no different than the choice of James Bond coming in and throwing his hat stylishly up onto the coat rack to try and impress Moneypenny. That's got the same value as any type of flirtatious line that he might say to her. I'm thinking about like the old James Bond films. So yeah, I think one big kind of piece of advice I would give to anybody writing dialogue is don't try and separate. Just because it has a separate element on the page of a script doesn't mean it's any more or less significant than any of the other action on the page. And I know that's like saying everything on the page is important. It is, but what your character is doing when they say that has the same value as what they might do, just purely through visual action.
I know what you're getting at. I think it is what you said there, and it's an interesting way of phrasing it. It's the choice to speak, and I think it is a choice to speak. It's not. I think so often when you get kind of people moving into screenwriting, the first thing you think of when you think about writing a film is the dialogue. I think when you're coming into it and you're new to it, that's the thing that pops into your head. You go, oh right, I'm going to write this really cool line. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And so I think that one of the things that you kind of have to train yourself to not do as you're developing as a writer is to not force dialogue, not force it out, not have the, hi, how are you? Yeah, I'm fine, thank you. How are you doing? Yeah, I'm quite well. All is well, thank you. Just cut it off. Don't have that. Jump in halfway through a scene, and it's then the choice to speak and the active choice to speak in the same way, to pick up on your point about Bond, in the same way that he's actively choosing, because he's a character that's in control. He's a character that's very calm and things like that. Then he's actively choosing to shoot that person, or he's actively choosing to, drive that car in that specific way because he's calm and in control. And so you as a writer have to also then make the same choice to speak and when to speak. And then because it's one of these things, I was thinking about this earlier on, all these kind of rules of writing and things like that, and rules to kind of play by. And I think it's one of these things you've got to learn the rules in order to break the rules and then do something interesting with them. Because you then, on the flip side of all of this, is that you then have the characters out there that have word vomit, and you have and that will just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk, and they're not really saying anything. And it's the trick with that is to, again, it's still a choice. The character isn't necessarily choosing to, because they have their things, but the writer has to. And what's being communicated by what they're saying, what's the subtext of that sentence, and it's actually nothing to do with the words at that point. It's nothing to do with the words they're saying. It's to do with what the words and what the act of speaking is implying to them or to the audience and to the characters in that moment. And so I think you're right. I think it has to be a choice, and don't feel as though you sort of have to have people talking. Some of the most arresting scenes that you'll ever come across are silent, and it's a person walking into a room and picking up a card and reading it, and then putting it back down again and walking out the door. And you learn more. A picture tells a picture is worth 1,000 words is a cliche, but it's true, and it's so important. And these things are really useful, I think, for new writers to bear in mind as when they're approaching dialogue.
And, I think a big part of it is knowing your scene well. Because if you don't understand the purpose of the scene, the driving action of the scene, where the real drama of the scene is, what the subtext of the scene might be, or what the subtext of some of the actions might be interpreted as, you can be wasting your time writing dialogue. And so so much of this ultimately boils down to knowing your characters, but more than that, knowing your scenes. I don't get too hung up on character bios. I know a lot of people write them extensively before they develop a project. I have been criticized in the past of not developing my characters enough sometimes, and so I do make an effort to do some sort of bios and stuff like that. But I don't get so deep into I won't have like a big extensive questionnaire where I'll try to figure out like how would they react in this situation, how would they react in that situation, because sometimes I do just let the scene, it's great to have a character who's very quiet and timid sometimes just let loose. It can be, or having a real like tough, strong, silent type, so to speak, break down and start crying, or show a more emotionally fragile side to themselves. These moments can be great. And I think dialogue, I like my characters to, I think, have the freedom as well to go where we need them to go in that scene, and to sometimes be surprising. And so, yeah, you really need to know your scenes. I think you really need to know what your scene is about and what you're trying to do. And then you got to ask yourself, I think, what ingredients do I need to make that happen? Sometimes you don't need your characters to speak. Sometimes you do, I wanted to get in just before we've kind of just to kind of almost like the third act of this talk, to kind of look at some practical kind of tips that writers can employ. I've made a list of maybe 4 or 5 here, and maybe you have your own that you can kind of throw in as well, but maybe we can discuss these. I think some of these we've touched on, but I think it's worth just kind of giving out this kind of shopping list really of things to think about when you're writing dialogue. The first one, I think, there's this piece of advice that I see all the time anyway, and it's something that's been taught to me in the past as well, and I don't agree with it. And it's the idea of listen to how people speak, and then try and work that into your writing. That is the worst way to write dialogue, I think, because you are essentially... because movies don't sound like that. I mean, characters in movies speak differently than the way we do in real life, and it is amazing to me that I have to explain that sometimes to people. And even in a movie like I would compare, we mentioned James Bond, right? The way James Bond speaks, it's like everybody knows to wait for him to finish before they speak next, because he's probably got a quip or he's probably got a one-liner. They know, don't interrupt Captain America when he's talking, because he's got to say his line. And it's even in a movie like Trainspotting, where characters speak in a much more realistic way, they're speaking in a way that is still very much allowing each other to speak. We don't allow each other to speak. The only reason we're not cutting each other off here is because there's a delay. We don't
literally.
If you go out into the world and try and speak in one-liners and stuff like that, you won't have time to have those dramatic pauses. You won't, people will just assume you're finished and just jump in, or people won't let you finish and they'll just cut in. People cut each other off all the time, and that doesn't make for great dialogue. When even in the West Wing, they don't cut each other off that much. They wait for each other to finish and they feed off each other's lines. We don't do that in the real world. So I think there's a lot to be said for understanding how characters speak in movies and TV, how they can speak in movies and TV, and what others have done in the past. But there's also understanding the reality of how we speak and knowing how not to apply that. I think, and so, yeah, fine. You can still sit in the park and eavesdrop on people as they walk past, but you've got to make sure that you're not just assuming that, okay, well, that's how people speak, so that's how I'll write my conversation. No, it's got to be far more. It's got to be far more thought out than that.
I think there's definite pros to it. I think that there's a middle ground, because taking that as your sort of I agree with you. You can't, people speak differently in movies. There's no doubt about that, because they have to, necessity and things like that. And also, no one wants to listen to, Marjorie having a chat to Dawn, and it's boring. Like, no offense, Marjorie and Dawn, but like, you're not as interesting as Don Corleone. So I think the the middle ground there though is I've done that before. I've done that where when I was living in Wales, I was writing something that was specifically very Welsh, and I didn't record anyone. Because I think that's creepy, but I did, listen to people on the bus and kind of absorb that kind of vibe and everything, and try to understand it. And I think there's a real merit to that if you're understanding how people kind of speak regionally, for example, and how you might put that together and weave that into a character. And I've heard people doing it before, looking for stories, looking for inspiration and things to kind of go around like that. And so I think there's definitely a merits to it. And it might well be one of those things that's, like I was saying earlier about, learning the rules so you can break the rules. Kind of once you figure out how real people speak and you de-Hollywood your dialogue machine in your brain, then maybe you get better dialogue. Maybe, I don't know, I'm just kind of making this up as I'm talking, but like there's something, maybe there's something in that. But I agree. I do tend to agree with you. I think that because literally as I'm going now, if I was going to write it has taken me so long to get this sentence out, and it always does. And I'm kind of doing this on purpose to make a point, but but I also do this anyway. This is not nice to listen to. It's choppy. It's I mean, don't turn off, please. But it's choppy. It's difficult, and it's distracting, and it's it's not nice. And fine for a natural conversation like we're having, but not fine if you are relaxing at the end of the day and you're throwing on, I don't know, the WandaVision or whatever. It's not fun, it's not good, and you're not getting anywhere with it unless you stylize it like you might do if you're Seth MacFarlane and you're Family Guy. But then there's a whole other argument to that, which is that they're cartoons, so it's inherently non-naturalistic. Therefore, the use of very highly naturalistic dialogue, as you might be able to define it, makes them get away with more. But then it's actually not that naturalistic. So there's a whole thing, and we actually maybe should do a video on the dialogue of Family Guy, because I think it's and Seth MacFarlane writing, because I think it's a really interesting kind of area to explore. But yeah, no, I agree with you. It's not the be all and end all, and I think you can get a bit hung up on trying to mimic natural speech for sure.
And it's because so much of what we say to one another is lacking in function. There's a bit of function in there, but there's a much more imaginative way to get there. And I think that's one of the other points that I would say is that you should try and be imaginative with your dialogue in the same way that we would try to be imaginative in writing action. We're aware that two people just pointing a gun at each other might be a bit of a cliche, or we recognize that we talked about the new Matrix film a few weeks back, and they even acknowledge in the movie that we need to find new ways. Like, what does bullet time look like now? What does it mean to people now? Like, what's the new bullet time going to be? We recognize that we have to be on our toes when it comes to creating interesting action. Making sure that we're not falling into cliche, or that it's not too passive for the audience, or that we're keeping the audience engaged. And we need to make sure that our dialogue is just as imaginative. And again, I go back to True Detective. True Detective is a really great way of it. Just the dialogue is always imaginative. It's always delivered in a way that is not the first way you would think that. I think the opening line of True Detective is Woody Harrelson saying, you don't get to pick your parents, and you don't get to pick your partner. And he's talking about Rust Cole, played by Matthew McConaughey, and kind of their partnership. And that's such a brilliant line that just sums up everything you need to know about, like, it wasn't my choice to be paired with him. Now, he could say that. He could say, they could say, so tell me about Rust Cole. Well, it wasn't my choice to be paired with him, I tell you that much. he could have said something like that, but they're going to go for something a little bit more imaginative. They're going to go for the second take. They're going to go for the third take, which is you don't get to choose your parents, you don't get to choose your partner. Just as effective, more effective, because you're now getting the audience to think and admire the dialogue. Again, I think, does your audience admire the way that your characters are speaking? Does your audience wish they could be as witty as that person, or wish they had thought of that line as well? And I think that can be a big part of it.
You know what? There's a scene that always springs to mind when I think of dialogue that I love, and it's the scene in Steve McQueen's Hunger, and it's the sparring match between Michael Fassbender and Liam Cunningham, and it's a masterful sequence. It's half an hour, and the bulk of it's uncut. And it's the two guys sat across the table just having a conversation, having a cigarette, things like that, and they dance around the subject, and they move around it, they're not necessarily always saying exactly what they're thinking. I think Edna Walsh wrote that, I think, and it's so great, and it's so masterful, and it is that thing of admiring the craft of it, and admiring the way, you made me think of it then by saying, what do you admire about the way these characters speak? And it dovetails with what I was saying about kind of region and context and things like that, because you have here two Northern Irish men having a conversation in a prison about the British. It is a very specific moment in time, and has to be treated accordingly, and is treated accordingly. But it's a boxing match. That scene is a boxing match, and they are. It's just verbal. It's a verbal joust, and they go backwards and forwards, but their body language moves backwards and forwards as well. Liam Cunningham scored a point against Michael Fassbender, and he kind of, okay, I'll lean back for a bit, and then he lights a cigarette and he leans back in, and Liam Cunningham, and it's a great sequence to kind of to look at your point there in terms of admiring the way people speak, and in terms of craft of dialogue. I don't think it gets much better than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, another point that I would raise is don't get too hung up on the functionality of dialogue. Sometimes it is okay to just say it's raining. There's nothing wrong with having a little bit of breather, and where not every line is revealing something, where not every line is giving us this deep insight into the character or whatever. Sometimes it is okay for characters to just to point out the obvious every now and again, but it should still feel a little bit more. It should feel more interesting than just regular kind of small talk. I do think small talk is,
and you got to pick your moments from that.
Yeah, I do think small talk is just the mark of bad dialogue, though. When characters are saying things that have zero value. If you want to say it's raining outside, go tell a person, bring an umbrella. You don't have to say it's raining. You can say bring an umbrella, or you can have the character hand them an umbrella. And it might not be the most imaginative thing, but it's the audience then saying, oh, it must be raining. They're now able to derive information from that, even in that kind of small talk kind of moment. I think there's nothing worse than characters saying, hey, how are you? It's just, do we care? Surely I should. Yeah, surely I should know that, right? Or when characters pick up the phone and they start talking on the phone, sometimes I'm thinking to myself, yeah, there's no way you've dialed the phone that quickly. But then I'm also thinking to myself, well, what, do I really want them sitting there waiting for the phone to pick up when there's no real drama in the phone picking up or anything like that? It's the same thing with conversations. Like, yeah, okay, that might not be how people start a conversation on the phone, but it doesn't matter. Do I really want the boring alternative, which is the reality of how we tend to talk to each other on the phone, or how we talk to each other in when we haven't seen each other? So I think don't be afraid to have just, let's say, bog standard dialogue that doesn't really, you wouldn't die in a hill to keep it in the script. but don't make the mistake of small talk either. I think is something, and that's maybe more of a personal thing, but you don't see it that
Yeah,
often
for sure.
in kind of Hollywood movies. You don't see it that often. When you watch, I've been watching Peaky Blinders lately, and there's no small talk in that show. Everything is just, all the dialogue is still there, even if it does feel like it's just two people shooting the breeze. Sometimes it's not, though.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I think it's the it's light and shade, isn't it? We say about comedy balancing out darkness and things like that in screenwriting and storytelling generally. You've got to kind of have that so you're not fatiguing the audience. But you have this thing with dialogue as well, that if you write something that is all just iconic dialogue, then it's going to sound like a quote book. And that's not how people speak, and it's fine. At the same time, if you write something that's just small talk, then that's it's that same thing. It's having the variation, and it's having the ups and the downs, I think, isn't it? That's important to try and get across, and then you're creating something varied and textured, and that's an interesting thing to do, I think, and an essential thing to do to keep an audience interested.
And one other quick one as well: avoid things like "so" or "well," and that kind of stuff in dialogue. You'll get aspiring screenwriters sometimes writing things like, I don't know, just making something up like, "So, Danny, I want you to go off to London first thing tomorrow." And it's like, no, just tell him, just say, "Danny, you're on the first train to London tomorrow." Just leave it at that.
Yeah. It's just more
you don't have
interesting.
to be putting in the "so" at the beginning, or that kind of. It's almost like those little intros to the dialogue, or another one like, "Well, let me see." It's do you have any? Do you have change for a tenner? Well, let me see. And it's just, none of that is great dialogue, of course, but it's just, you don't need the "well." You can just have the character say, "Let me see." It's that introduction to the line you want to say. And you could just cut it off. It's like a prologue. It's like a prologue with no information in it. That "well" or "so" or any of that kind of stuff, forget about it. Just cut it. I think just go through your script, and any of those moments that are literally just introductions to the point itself or the line itself, just cut it. The actors will thank you for it. And also, the actors will just work that stuff in themselves. If it feels more natural for them to say, "Well, let me see," let them say it. It's hardly breaking your script to to make that amendment, either you removing it or they adding it later. So, as an actor, what do you look for? You used to be an actor.
I don't know, because it's tricky to say, because for me now, from my point of view, everything dovetails into everything else. And so, I don't, it's very difficult to understand, because it's so, like we were saying earlier, it's an extension of action. It's just still action. I think really what I look for would be great moments of dialogue. So, you have those, I've been down on kind of quotable moments and things like that, but, things that feel great to say, things that move you in some way, and great kind of emotional lines of dialogue and things like that. But also just things where it just feels natural, and it just feels natural to speak, and it feels natural to say. And what I was going to say just a moment ago it would dovetails really nicely into that, is that if you're sat there and you're writing a screenplay, and you haven't read any of your dialogue aloud, and you're wondering why it's not quite hitting the ear right, then just sit there and read it. Just read it, because that's what your actor's going to do. And that's what I used to do when I get a script. I'd read my lines aloud, and I'd read the others in my head, and I'd read my lines aloud, to try and get a feel for it, and to try and get an understanding of how well these lines will go. And so I think, ease of speech is a big thing for actors. You don't want to be, unless it's Star Trek and you need to set the flux capacitor to the neutron flow, Captain, then the technobabble is one thing, but then don't overuse that for anything, God. But unless it's that kind of deal, then a gentle flow nice, easy to deliver lines are really great, and they're always great for actors. But then also it can be the opposite. I don't know, John, is the honest answer to you. I don't know. It depends entirely on so many weird and wonderful things. I think the dialogue that fits the character. One of your pet peeves the other day was about characters that clearly can't do their jobs. Characters who say stuff that is just clearly not something they would ever say it would be one of mine as an actor. If it takes me out of it, if it's jarring in any way, shape, or form that isn't clearly intentional, then I'm done. I'm putting that script down. Thank you very much. Never mind. It does kind of come down to that. That's a big one for me.
I am glad that you just said, it depends, because this is again why I don't dwell so heavily on the teaching of writing dialogue. I'd rather spend the time teaching you to write meaningful stuff for your character and stuff that activates the audience. And if the dialogue is part of that, then great. If the visuals are doing the work, then that's fine too. No one has ever come out of a movie theater saying, I wish the characters spoke more. No one's ever come out of a movie theater from a good movie saying, I wish the characters spoke less. It's all part of it's just all part of the symphony. And and it just all has to be in moderation, and it all has to serve its purpose. Doesn't mean every line of dialogue has to be that big emotional sucker punch. It doesn't mean every line of dialogue has to be quotable. Most lines aren't quotable. Most lines aren't meant to be quotable. But as you say, there has to be something. It has to be something the actors can work with. It has to be something the audience can work with as well. But at the end of the day, it does depend on the project, doesn't it? And it does depend on how, on what you want to achieve as the storyteller. So yeah, I think it's one of these things. It's not going to be the first. It's not going to be the last time we talk about dialogue, because there's so many different approaches to it. There's so many things we haven't even scratched the surface on.
And I think it is. It's for sure. It's beautifully summed up, by the way. I think it is one of those things that it does depend so much and does vary so much, and there are so many different schools of thought and techniques and things like that. You got to find your own. You've got to find your own way of doing it, and I think you can. When you're watching films, or what, if you listen to someone, and so you get people out there in the world sometimes that speak in really interesting ways. There's a guy at the pub where I live, and we call him the pensive Irishman, and it's not you, John, the pensive Irishman who sits on a table on his own. And he's sitting there and he's thinking and he's looking into his pint. And we overheard him speak for the first time. He's been knocking around for about 6 months, and we heard him speak for the first time not that long ago. And it was groundbreaking, because he just has this low voice and very deliberate phrasing and things like that. And I'm sat there as a writer listening to him thinking, what an interesting way of speaking. But I wouldn't drop him. You can't necessarily drop something like that into the middle of EastEnders, whereas you perhaps could drop it into, something else. So find just whatever it is you're trying to write, find something that's similar, or something of a similar tone or genre or theme or something like that, or a character that's similar, or a real person, or whatever it is, and listen to it. And allow that to inspire you. And don't try and be Sorkin. Don't try and be Tarantino. Don't try and be anything. Just be you. And hopefully some of what we've discussed. That's very kind of uplifting, that, isn't it? Hopefully some of what we've discussed here will be useful to to figuring out that version of you.
There's I'll leave you with this great line, one of my favorite lines of dialogue of all time, from Mad Men. Yeah, this older woman dies at her desk in this New York skyscraper, and they're trying to write a eulogy for her, or trying to write an obituary, for her. And they're thinking of something to say. And I don't think any of them really know the woman that well, but the boss, the owner of the company, who himself is probably of similar age, knew her from the beginning. And he says, she was born in 1898 in a barn. She died on the 37th floor of a skyscraper. She's an astronaut. And it floored me when I heard that line first. And the reason why, I think, is because that is the level of thought that you would expect from a group of advertising executives. That is the level of poetry that you would expect from people who have shaped our consumer habits for decades, you know? And it's appropriate for that show. It is to the standard of that, of who those characters are. You believe they have the skills. It comes back to what you said about my own pet peeve. You believe they have the skills to do their job, because if that's what they're writing for obituaries, imagine what they're doing for that pitch meeting tomorrow, for Heinz or whatever.
Yeah, for sure.
Anyway.
Yeah. I mean, Mad Men is. I got Mad Men on my wall right here. I love it. Can you see it? Just there. Mad Men's on the wall. It's that's a great pick to do that with there. And that's, if actually, you know what, to top it off, that if I was going to give any piece of advice for writing dialogue or writing anything, go watch Mad Men. It's just great.
It's everything we talked about. Yeah. Thank you very much, Marcus. We'll be back next week to talk about. We'll be talking about The Godfather next week. We're going to start a series of classic film club, I guess, where we go through an old classic. The kind of movies that everybody says you need to watch before you die. Let's explore them, see how they hold up today. Let's see, would they be on our list of
extract some of that wisdom.
Yeah, let's see how we get on with it. So thanks very much, Marcus. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow with another video. If you haven't already, do check out our website, scriptdepartment.net. Follow us on social media, links in the description, and do subscribe to the podcast and the YouTube channel as well. Just search for The Script Department. Thanks very much.